So let me make an introduction to Jason, who we all know pretty well. Been teaching at Missisquoi Valley Union High School for 20 years. He's shaking his head yes. He was VFW's Local Teacher of the Year in 2019, Missisquoi Teacher of the Year in 21 and 22, semi-finalist for Vermont Teacher of the Year in 22, semi-finalist. Jason served in the Vermont legislature from 1997 to 2022. In 2019, he was a recipient of the Victor Swenson Award recognizing excellence in the classroom. Summer of 21, he was co-director of the prestigious National Endowment for the Humanities, Freedom and Unity program that exposed Vermont's Revolutionary War sites to out-of-state teachers. He's published 3 books, all of which are focused on the impressive and important history of the state of Vermont. Would you please welcome back Jason Barney.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
The first thing I want to do is start off with a thank you. Thank you for having me back. But probably the biggest thank you that I want to give is to the taxpayers in Franklin, Swanton, and Highgate, the home school where I teach at MVU. I think what I do is kind of known in the community. I teach the Abenaki and local history course at MVU. And just to give you a little bit of the schedule, I was at school this morning. I will be going back to school this afternoon because my students have a field trip to the Sheldon Historical Society. Last week we were at the Franklin Historical Society. The course that I teach is designed to get the students out of the classroom as much as possible. And I would love to have a semester course where the students are in the classroom for maybe 10 classes, and then for the other 30 classes, because the class will meet 40 or 45 times in one semester, where they're out at local history venues. And it surprises some people to learn or to talk about there are that many local history venues for our students to visit. And I would love to take them there. So thanks to the community members for supporting the budget. Thanks to my administration for letting me do these sorts of things. And this is my life. I am a history nerd, and I love talking history. And for those of you who are here, I appreciate your attention. And I hope we can have, I hope it's just not me presenting. I hope it's a good conversation, maybe with some memories, and maybe with some stories as well. So a little bit of backstory about this. I was raised in Franklin County. I was raised in Highgate. I graduated from MVU in 1993. I had some truly excellent teachers, Bob Krieger, Joe Maley, Randy Krebs. And they were really, really good, but I never got sort of a local history perspective on things. I didn't know about the missile silos that were in Alberg and Swanton. I didn't know about Revolutionary War sites that were in the area. It was in college, and then later on when I got my master's, where I was reading through the Franklin history book and maybe chatting with a good friend of mine, Brian Rainville, where there was this reference in the Franklin town history book about a commune. And I served in the Vermont legislature when I was a young conservative. The idea of, I was aware that hippies had come to the state of Vermont, and I had sort of this repellent view of that time period. And I was young, and I wasn't familiar with getting to know people on a personal level. So I just started to do a little bit of research about the Franklin Commune and about Vermont's history. And it shocked me to come to learn and understand that while the Vietnam War was going on, while the civil rights movement was unfolding, while people were being drafted and serving and dying in Vietnam, and family members were having some of their sons, maybe daughters, coming home, that Vermont became sort of this mecca or hub for people who were pushing back against the status quo of the 50s and early 60s. And it was just weird to me, as much as I loved history, and some of you are maybe painfully aware of how much I love history, that I really hadn't, what was this Franklin Commune? What was this thing? So I started to do a little bit of research, And the Franklin Commune was not unique. If you have a newspapers.com account, I was surprised to learn that there were at least 200 communes that were set up in the state of Vermont. This researcher is John Fackler. He gave his presentation at UVM in 1972, and at the time, he was saying that there were about 200 of these properties that were set up. So first, I guess we can have a conversation about what exactly some of these properties were, right? Anybody want to throw out an idea, or anybody want to throw out a personal experience? What is a commune? What are we talking about? What were they trying to do in the late 60s and early 70s?
Back to the earth.
Yeah, just took the words out of it.
Back to the land, back to the earth? Anybody else?
They were poor little rich boys trying to get away from home.
They were poor little rich boys?
And girls, must forget girls. If there's boys, there's got to be girls.
Yes,
Anyone else?
SEX.
What's SEX? Yeah. So one of these actually is the Greenfield commune down in the Montpelier Barry area. And they advertised themselves. They actually came out with a pamphlet of free love. Like they wanted to go into the woods of Barry and so it's a time period. They're pushing back against everything that was unfolding in the 1960s, and you've got JFK's assassination, and you've got Bobby Kennedy's assassination, and Martin Luther King, and the draft is going on. So some of these wealthy out-of-staters, and some of them were just college kids, Vermont became a location where they could kind of get away. And some of them were very political, and some of these 200 communes, they're probably not actually communes. Some of them are probably college kids who came up in the summer of 1960. Mom or dad or grandpa had a second home in the state of Vermont. They smoked a lot of pot. They hooked up with whoever they wanted to hook up with in the summer of 1970 or 71, and then they went home. Some of them were a little bit more detailed than that, and the one in Franklin certainly was a lot more detailed than that. So I'll come back to this research in a minute, but I just think that this sort of grounds what the situation was as you get into 1969, 1970, 1971. So while you're going to hear information mostly about the Franklin Commune, the Franklin Commune certainly isn't the only one in Franklin County. This is from the Montgomery property called the Dreamers, and this photo was given to me by folks who did not who did not live on this commune, but went for the solstice celebration. I believe this photo is probably from 1972. So you can see families, some kids, there's a slide out in the field. With my research, I've been lucky enough now to make contact with 3 of the Dreamers, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I'm conducting my research in a minute. But I mean, Montgomery, even if you're from Franklin County, Montgomery's kind of hard to get to sometimes, right? So the fact that Franklin had a commune, Montgomery had a commune, there were others that we'll talk about. These were not isolated properties. So this photo's not meant to offend anybody, but this photo probably captures part of the spirit of the 1960s. If you saw the long hairs, if you saw the hippies out and about, if you weren't in Vermont or if you were in other parts of the country, you probably saw a little bit of this. This is one of the members of the Dreamer Commune. This was actually taken by a member of what they call the French Hill Commune. So if we had windows right up the hill where the St. Albans Town Forest is, there was also a commune there as well. And I was trying to explain to my students what this photo means, and I don't share this photo with everybody, but there are certain students that I feel confident will take it seriously. The idea of hippie holes, that people who are on the communes, I don't know if bathing or just being out and having fun in the woods, this was part of their existence. I've actually been able to identify who I think this woman is, and she has an interesting history which will come up a little bit later on. So During the course of the presentation, if any of you do have stories, if you had contact with people from the 1960s or the 1970s, I would love to hear some of those interactions. I am writing a 4th book right now. It's not on the communes or the counterculture. I would love to write that book at some point in time. But the easiest way to write about that era is to get the personal stories of people who lived through it. So if you have any questions, or if you have any comments that you want to make, feel free to raise your hand, and I would love to have that interaction. So I guess before I go on, do any of you want to mention any stories or anything that you experienced during the 1960s? Or 70s?
I ran a pharmacy back at that time in town, and we were aware of the commune up there and the different areas, but we really didn't know much about it. There were more rumors than anything, but basically it's what you're showing on the TV, on the screen. But we did have one, Walter Cronkite's daughter was up there, and she had a baby at the hospital in town here, and they wound up naming the baby Swamp Grass. That's about the only thing I remember. But it was kind of interesting because we had some interaction, but not very much.
So everybody heard most or all of that. So the teacher in me has heard almost all of those stories before. And a couple things that I want to correct the record because it's mostly right. I have to say, I don't know if Walter Cronkite's daughter ever went up to the Richford or Montgomery commune. I've heard it from several people, but I don't have the actual proof, so I don't know. Other people have said that Barney was at the Franklin commune, and the people on the Franklin commune are like, no, he was, Bernie Sanders was not at the Franklin commune. So swamp grass. That's swamp grass. Her name is Enid Sippen. She became pregnant and mothered the child of the person who set up the Dreamer commune. And yes, she came down to St. Albans and wanted to give birth in the great outdoors. And the birth became too painful. And the messenger reported, I think it's in April of 1971, that, yeah, she told the doctors that she wanted to name her daughter Swampgrass. So this is up from the French Hill Commune. If you were going through a book about the 1960s, you would see something like this photo in any book of the 1960s, but this is right up the hill from outside where we are right now. These photos were given to the Vermont Historical Society by people who were at the French Hill Commune, and it's great that we have access to these and that teachers can use them. Thank you for contributing, by the way. Anybody else have stories or memories of anything during this time period that you would like to share? I'm a teacher, you'll get an A if you do. So one of the things that I find really, really interesting, and I'll talk about this in more detail, as weird as people thought, out-of-staters who came to Vermont and wanted to be back to the landers, what they were doing is what you see in this photo. Yes, there was the drugs, and yes, there was the sex, but a lot of them did want to try to set up farms, or they did want to try to set up properties where they were doing work that my grandparents were doing, maybe some of your families were doing. They wanted to learn from Vermonters, and they wanted to replicate a simpler way of life. So I don't know if this building is still standing. If you go up to the town forest, there are some houses that branch off on either side of the road. I've made contact with a couple members of the French Hill Commune, and I believe this building is still standing. I don't know if it's still used as a house, though. So this is the map that's on my wall. As I said, I'm a nerd when it comes to this stuff. If you give me a research number, like 200 communes in the state of Vermont, I will try to research where all of those communes were. So based on interviews and based on newspaper stories, I've been able to track down about 95 of them. But I think the other 105, I think the other 100 or whatever, are probably just those second homes where people were visiting for a summer and the commune movement was the thing at the time. So, history is facts. History is uncomfortable. History has to do with topics which some people don't like to talk about. In the world at the time, as people from out of state are coming and setting up their communes, locals, kids, are over fighting in Vietnam. And some of those kids are being killed. And some of them are coming home in body bags. And I didn't think that it would be appropriate to research the idea of the communes without doing this story as well, that there were local Vermonters who were killed over in Vietnam. I think it's appropriate to remember those individuals and talk about the sacrifice that they made. And some of the field trips that I do have my students go on are with Bruce Spalding to clean some of the veterans' gravestones that are in local cemeteries. So while I love this research and I'm intense about trying to promote that this was an era of Vermont history, I do try to be very respectful of the fact that veterans have a story from Vietnam as well.
So did the Vermonters at that time have resentment against these young folks who weren't participating?
Yes. And part of that resentment comes from stories like this, where a lot of us, and I'm from Franklin County too, right? So a lot of us would have probably looked at these hippies, these kids, buying these farms that are going out of business. Well, this is part of the press at the time. This was a commune that is down in the southeast corner of the state. You know, kids think they can do anything, right? And kids think they can operate a wood stove when they don't know how to do it. And kids think they can party all the time and be safe. Well, in this instance, this is not at the Packer Corners commune, which is a very well-known one at the bottom portion of the state. It's Johnson Pastures. 4 people died because somebody lit a wood stove and didn't know how to vent it out the side of the building. In other words, the kids had put the stove in and they didn't know how to properly do it. So as part of the research, one of the individuals who survives this fire actually ends up on the Franklin Commune for a brief amount of time, and I've talked to her about this event. And she's open and she'll talk about it, but I'll get more into the resentment in a second. So in Franklin, this is the house, this is the property where the commune started. It's off from Hannah Road, next to Beaver Meadow Road in Franklin. I believe the name of the long driveway where this house used to be located is Shady Maple Lane in Franklin. This was an operating farm. There was an auction. The folks who ended up operating the Franklin Commune, they did not purchase the property on their own. They actually had a wealthy out-of-stater who was sympathetic to the hippies and sympathetic to the anti-war movement and sympathetic to the commune movement. Those folks, some of them from California, some of them from the Chicago area, they arranged for this property to be purchased. And I think at the time there were over 300 acres that went with this property. The communards, when they came, they did not want to use a lot of equipment that farmers at the time would have thought was easy to use. Before I get into that though, I want to mention some local families who did not push back against the communards. Some local families were very friendly with them. And some of you may remember Nat Warman, who passed, I think, just a couple of years ago. This is Nene Warman. And this photo is taken, I believe, in '72. And these are some of the commune kids visiting the Warman family off the commune in Franklin. Now, just a story about the pushback. And I think it's fine to go public with this because the family told me about it. Apparently, in the spring of 1970, because Nat Warman had written some editorials for the Enosburg Standard at the time, that was the local newspaper, a local showed up at his property with a gun and basically asked him why he was writing editorials so pro-hippie, so pro-commune. A couple members of the family told me that story, and a couple people from Franklin told me that story as well. I want to do a lot of research. I don't know if I care who the local was who showed up with the gun, but just the story itself shows you that there was pushback against members of the commune. So George Truex, he also was somebody who reached out to the commune, became very, very friendly with them. The Warmans did not go over and party with the commune. They had their own kids. George Truex did not go over and party at the commune. He was basically a dad to them. He was a horse farmer, and one of the things that the communards said that they wanted to do by doing things the old-fashioned way was they wanted to operate the land with horses. They wanted to go so far back that they weren't using the modern equipment of the time. They wanted to try using horses. So George Truex went over and helped them sugar. This is taken in the sugar house. And he went over and he coached one of the communards, Peter McFarland, on how to be safe around these big animals that these city folk probably had never been exposed to. So he is very integral to the operation of the commune. This is another local, Walt Bennett. He was, I believe, a friend of George Truex, and he was very friendly with the folks on the commune. He also helped out with the horses too. To the extent that I haven't been able to place this photo exactly yet, but there was a situation, I believe, on the Bennett property where there was supposed to be a barn raising, and everybody on the commune left the commune property and unpaid, just being good community members, went over to the Bennett farm and helped them raise this barn. And I don't have a picture of her, even though she lived in my house for a little while when I was a kid. Grace Spooner. She lives up on Spooner Road, just south of the commune. This is a picture of the Spooner property today, and there's multiple stories from people on the commune walking through the woods all the way up to the Spooner farm and helping Grace Spooner and Ken Spooner do their hay in temperatures that are in the high 80s or low 90s in the middle of the summer. So yes, there was pushback and yes, there was tension, but there were locals who just tried to be friendly, just tried to be good locals. So the folks on the commune, they didn't take a lot of photos, but these photos are from '71, and they show the out-of-staters trying to sugar in a way that I would think would be impossibly labor-intensive, but they're doing it using horses. And having interviewed these folks, they are very proud of trying to do things this way. In their mind, even though the commune didn't last long, they walked the walk. They did something that they put a lot of thought into, but then they followed through with. And then there are other photos with the sugaring season of, they sugared in 1970 and 1971. So one of the other things that I love to be able to do with photographs, you can sort of get a hint of when a photograph was taken based on some of the specifics. Anybody in the room want to guess as to what part of sugaring season this photo was likely taken during?
Spring.
What's that?
April.
Yeah. Sugaring season is almost over. Why?
Flood.
In these photos, you know that this is peak sugaring season because there's a lot of snow on the ground, right? Well, they may be approaching their last boil sometime in April at this point in time. So photographs can tell you a lot, and this is the type of conversation that I would have with my students. So the messenger. The messenger sent Mr. Ed Price up to the commune in April, I believe. Yeah, April 23rd of 1970. And he visited the commune. He just knocked on the door, said, "Hi, I'm from the St. Albans Messenger." Some locals are in a huge tizzy about what you guys are doing. Other locals are just curious. Can I interview you? And having gotten to know some of the members of the commune, in their 80s now, I can place some of the people who are mentioned in the story. A research item that I have not been able to place that is mentioned in this story, the reporter asks about the kids, and one of the kids is not on the commune at the time. One of the kids is reported to be at the Franklin Elementary School. So they did try to educate the kids. I guess we would call it homeschooling today, but there was a time period where one of the commune kids was enrolled in Franklin. I don't think there's any records of when that child was actually at the Franklin Elementary School, but that would also be information that I would love to have. So, is there anybody in the room who would feel comfortable sharing where you were when Kent State University happened? The shootings at Kent State.
Virgin Islands.
You were in the Virgin Islands? So you,
I lived down there while this was all going on.
so you were in the Virgin Islands when Kent State happened?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Thank you.
It's on board a ship in the Navy.
You were on board a ship in the Navy?
What was the year?
1970, sorry, 1970. So, and do you remember exactly hearing about it? Like,
Yeah, it was pretty horrifying. I mean, a lot of the sailors that served me were really bummed that troops fired on what they said were essentially our own people.
yeah.
And then I actually had a colleague at Enosburg High School that was a math teacher, who was a classmate with the girl that was killed, and you see her kneeling by her.
The famous photo of, yeah, she's screaming, right? Yeah, okay. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else? Richard?
I was in college at Duke University. It was a big thing. I think a bunch of kids, myself, at least once or twice, had already gone up to DC for some Vietnam War protests, and I think that might have even led to another one pretty quickly after that happened in '07. Yeah, as you might guess, a huge event on a big college campus.
Yeah. Anybody else? So, when I talk with my high school students about, was there somebody else who wanted to? Yeah, sorry.
I was in high school in Ohio, but my brother was at Kent State in Apple.
Do you know there are entire college courses taught just about the events at Kent State University? So I wouldn't be surprised. So did he witness the actual event, or?
No.
No? Thank you for sharing. So when I talk to my students about it, I think now there's sort of this perception that if the protesters were throwing rocks, or if the protesters were throwing bottles, that they deserved it. And it almost gives me chills sort of repeating that line, because at the time, even if you were for the Vietnam War, even if you were, because Nixon was pulling the troops home. Like, for everything that Nixon did wrong, Nixon was pulling the troops home at that point in time. Why did Kent State happen in the first place? Because Cambodia had been bombed and the war was expanding, right? I think it's hard for people to personalize kind of what you said. American servicemen, regardless of the situation, should not fire on American citizens. So the local history connection is, this is Burlington, and this is Charlie Pratt. This is one of the members of the Franklin Commune. There was a troop bus where locals were going off to join the military, and after Kent State, they wanted to shut Burlington down, and this individual sat in front of the troop bus. He put his body in front of the tire, and he tried to stop what he could. He tried to, I think that the popular saying from the 60s, you got to stop the wheels and the levers and you have to stop the machine. Well, he tried. So he was arrested, and I was able to interview him before he died. And he told me the story of getting in front of the troop bus. And you know, from his perspective, I think he maybe regretted being as radical, but at the time, to see 4 college students die that way. Comment? Yeah.
I was in college on the GI Bill after 8 years in the Air Force. And I remember how disgusted myself and several other GIs felt about the National Guard and their lack of training and their fear of these kids that are rioting. And we thought that that was a real awful thing, that they would kill Americans.
Yeah. So one of the things I do in class is I try to take national events that would be in any average history textbook, and I try to make the local history connections. So yeah, the Kent State protests happened, but because of Kent State, people from the Franklin Commune, I mean, this is about as local as you can get, they were in Burlington trying to shut the city down. Sorry. Yes.
My guess is there were people, Vermonters, who weren't from the communes, who were also participating in trying to shut it down.
Yes.
So the takeaway isn't that the communes people were the only ones that were against this, right?
Yes.
Vermonters, and it included people from the communes.
So thank you for, oh man. I want to present for like 3 hours now.
That's part 2.
This guy is a UVM professor.
Okay.
And so really getting into the politics of it, right? And this is something that I come up against a lot when I cover a topic like this. If a teacher covers something in class, how much is their own bias coming out, right? So I can guarantee you, as an objective observer of this time period, Charlie Pratt was recruiting students. UVM was pissed. UVM wanted him fired. There's another person on the commune, Jim Nolfi. He also was recruiting students to be at the Franklin Commune. So if you're an administrator at UVM and you have parents who are paying for their kid's education and the kid is skipping class going up to the commune in Franklin, as an administrator, are you going to come down on Charlie Pratt? Are you going to come down on Jim Nolfi? Is the professor influencing the student in an inappropriate way? So college is different than high school, but where's the line? So back to a little bit more nice stuff. So with the horses, members of the commune also came up to visit the people who had moved in. So this is Peter McFarland. You'll hear a lot about him. I don't know which one of the commune kids this is, but I believe this is her niece. And Peter McFarland is dead now, but his niece was involved in comic books, and she has her own website, and when her uncle died, she put a really nice eulogy up for him. And I was able to make contact with her based on what she had, what she had printed online for a eulogy for Peter. She remembers when this photo was taken. I interviewed her, and she remembers coming up to Vermont to visit her uncle on the commune, and she remembers being in the house, and she remembers when this photo was taken. So I've only interviewed her once, but I want to go back to that because sometimes childhood memories are a little bit different. Childhood memories are a little bit more special. So this is Lou Andrews, and honestly, I think the nice thing about this photo is this could be any Franklin County wife working on the farm. This could be any of our family members having worked out in the fields, you know, brought food to whoever was doing the haying that day. Lou was on the commune for a good portion of the time, and she still lives in Burlington, and she's a real sweetheart with her time. She's been very gracious with the interviews. This is also like a very meaningful photo to me because somebody who some of you may know, and certainly as a character, and I don't think he would be offended if I described him as a character, Hal Bill from Enosburg. So when I was in politics, Hal Bill and I had a very uncomfortable interaction at an Enosburg open house, where I think Act 60 was a political issue, and I didn't know Hal. I mean, he comes up to me with his cigar, or his cigar, and so it didn't go well. So I start researching this stuff, and I find out that Hal Bill lived on the Franklin Commune. And I reached out to him, and I was just like, hey, sorry about the uncomfortable interaction 20 years ago. Do you remember? He said, yes, I remember. And I said, would you mind if I sort of picked your brain and asked you for some memories on the Franklin Commune? And he has been the nicest guy with his time. I have done about 25 hours of interviews with him, trying to collect oral histories. And he's let me record all of them, and he has been a gem. Like, Tuesday is usually our day to conduct an interview, so I'm here with you guys, and Hal will have to wait to next week, but he has been a real joy and we're not sure, but if there is a photo of Hal Bill on the commune, that's him doing the work in the field. So it's a learning experience for everyone. How many of you have ever processed your own meat? Have you cleaned your own chickens? For out-of-staters, the idea of slaughtering their own animals was new, and it was uncomfortable for some of them. It was something that took a little bit of learning for them, but they did raise their own meat, and these pigs went in the freezer, and they were consumed over the winter. Oh, by the way, the pig pen was in the shape of a pentagon. My students won't get that, but... So, how am I doing on time? I don't want to... Okay, so drugs are an issue at the time. A lot of people are trying marijuana. At the time, marijuana is classified as a narcotic, so I think it was seen as a much more serious thing than it is today. And I think there was, as locals are looking at downtown St. Albans, as locals are looking at the college kids, seeing the long hairs, there's this fear and there's this reality that some of the pot is making its way into the high schools. Some of these kids are trying marijuana. And who's going to get blamed for it? It's the people on the Franklin Commune. It's the college kids from Burlington who are selling the weed to our kids, right? So this is a story from the St. Albans Messenger, and it just identifies that there was a public attempt to expose what was happening in the schools. So, relationships. George Truax's barn burns. His horse barn burns in July of 1971. George Truax was one of the folks that I mentioned earlier, the kind relationships that he had with the communards. So I just want to point this out. So this is from the St. Albans Messenger, and I'll talk a little bit about this. They've been very helpful. The St. Albans Messenger went up and took photos because there had been a series of barn fires in Franklin in 1970 and 1971. So they went up to George Truax's farm. And I asked some of the communards about this, and one of the individuals, Larry Mead, who in fact took a lot of these photos, when I conducted that oral history interview with him and he heard George's name and I mentioned the day of the fire, because I'd heard that several of the people of the commune left the property and then went to George's to just help him because he lost some of his horses. Larry Mead started to cry. It's been 51 years since that event. And from his perspective, George Truax was such a nice, kind soul that 51 years later, he was in tears because of the memory of seeing George dealing with the death of his horses. So, swamp grass. I believe this is the same woman. She leaves the Montgomery commune and she gets nixed in town because she had a prior arrest that the police were out looking for her on. And she gets arrested because of that prior arrest. So this is somebody else who has been really, really helpful as far as my research. The guy's name is Peter Hutcher. This is his wife, Linda, and this is his newborn child, Noah. This is taken in October of 1970. Again, you could very easily date the photo based on what you see with the trees and the foliage. So the story about this is, and this is the commune house, the story about this is Noah is born in October of 1971. Linda goes to the hospital to give birth. Peter had been out harvesting or working in the fields, so he had his coveralls on, and he will admit that he's a hippie. He hadn't showered for days. His wife's going into labor, and the doctor says, "You're going home. I don't want your filth in my hospital." And he missed the birth of his son.
Who was the doctor?
If I had the information, I wouldn't tell you. I don't know. I honestly don't know. So again, how do teachers sometimes impact their students? What is appropriate for teachers to bring into the classroom? So this is a high school class from Enosburg. I have to say, I'm so lucky that I'm not teaching during the 1960s, because I don't know what I would have done. There's a high school teacher from Enosburg who has an opportunity to bring 2 members of the Franklin Commune in to talk about different lifestyles. What would you guys have done? Would you have allowed 2 members of the commune into the class?
Now I would. I don't know about that.
What's that?
Now I would.
Now you would?
Because that's who I am now. Yeah.
Okay.
At that point, I would have been younger. I don't know. Right. Yeah.
I'm going to call on somebody from Franklin.
Hi, Jay. Maybe you'll get to it sometime along, but there were some very intelligent people that came out of the commune. And my wife was a town clerk for several years in Franklin, and she could probably direct you to a letter that she received from a doctor who was in that commune. Very well written. And there were doctors, lawyers, merchants, and chiefs, all came out of the commune. But, and from my point of view, I was brought up as a wasp, I guess you could call it. And I could not see, like the doctor said, the filth. How smart do you have to be, or how dumb do you have to be not to wash your hands once in a while? And that's what came out of the commune, the top and the bottom. And there was no middle in between there, something like. So take it from there.
Would you have let the students in, or would you have let commune members into? So MVU would have been created, because MVU was 1970 at that point in time. Or Enosburg, would you have cared, or did you hear about this, or?
Sure, let's hear from them. You don't have to agree with them, but, let's hear from them.
So, research. Sandra Gillum is the teacher. Sandra Gillum is still around, and I made contact with her. And I want to interview her. We've exchanged emails. She's willing to chat. And she had to go in front of the school board and defend the decision. And I think they had to approve any other guest speakers that were going to come in front of her class. So, local bands, music. Music is a huge part of the era. If I wasn't so tired after election night, sorry John, I would have been playing like the Grateful Dead or something as you guys came in. The music scene is huge. A lot of the people from the era, not just people on the communes, identify the Dead and Pink Floyd and the Rolling Stones and all of those bands as capturing the essence of how people felt, right? But there's a local element to this as well. So there's a local band, Grief, that is playing, and there's Homebrew, and there's other people who are sort of replicating the national musical scene. And I just put this out here because I don't think it's Grief, but it's one of the local bands. They're playing down at what we know as the Bayside Pavilion. And one of the Communard members, it's in the summer of 1970, they remember going to Bayside and hearing the local bands play. And because the Messenger ran the advertisements for when some of these bands were going to be playing, I can identify probably the night that those people were at Bayside as that Communard is leaving Franklin to go to other communes in Maine. So it's neat to try to put the timeline together. So the Messenger, again, in December of 1970, they identified that there are 6 communes in Franklin County, 1 in Fairfax. I don't know if that's the group in Fairfax that is very musically inclined. that has been, or Fairfield, that has been around for a while. I haven't been able to identify all of these. Obviously, we know about the Franklin Commune, we know about Montgomery. Enosburg Falls, do any of you know of a hippie colony or a commune that was in Enosburg Falls? I've heard of a place called Woodpecker Hill, but I have no information about the families or the groups that tried to set that up. So as a researcher, one of the things I like to do is give that information at places like this, and if people do have personal stories, then I can follow up with some of that research. And Bakersfield. I have no information about a property in Bakersfield either. The local state's attorney, McGinn, he wants to prevent Vermont from becoming a hippie haven. So he goes public with his views that he's going to take care of the hippies and he's going to make sure the long hairs don't invade Vermont. A lot of us can kind of snicker at this, but it also fell into town government as well. I believe it's the town of Sheldon, and I know it's other communities in the state of Vermont. Zoning was starting, and people were so anti-hippie that they tried to define a family unit so that communes were not allowed. So the Messenger is very supportive of Mr. McGinn's efforts to make sure that the hippies don't invade. So I know we're at about 50 minutes, and I want to get through some of the other photos and get to the end. But Larry Mead took a lot of photos on the commune. On this particular day, a lot of the women have left the commune, and the men are taking care of the kids. I haven't been able to peg this exact day yet, but several members of the commune remember going to the women's meeting, and several of the guys remember taking care of the kids. This is Barbara Nolfi from Burlington. Some of you may know the name. She was actually a candidate on the ballot, the progressive ballot. She was running for the Vermont House of Representatives. Barbara's, I believe, 80 years old now, and she was, in this photo, obviously she's collecting some produce in the fall, but she was one of the most important members of the commune. Some of the photos that Larry Mead took, I have not been able to identify who these individuals are. I have no idea who this individual was. He was on the commune in probably September of 1971. I have to admit, I kind of like his hair, but I don't know who he is. So Larry Mead, the guy who took all the photos, geocentric domes were really, really big during the time period. There's a commune in Glover, Vermont that has this huge, it almost looks like what we would think an astronomer would put around their telescope. So these domes, people in Franklin didn't want to build a big one, so he bought Mylar plastic, and he just made this dome, and this is where he spent the summer of 1971. So, what happened to the Franklin Commune? This is from the Messenger, November 23rd, 1971. It's a little difficult for me because I have a couple of different sources on this. Basically, a fire happened and the commune house was destroyed. Some people think that it may have been Peter McFarland smoking in bed and his ashes fell on the mattress and then the fire spread. Another source thinks that there was and I tend to agree with this source, over here on this side of the house there was a woodshed, and if you can think of your garages at home, somebody in the woodshed, if you can think of cords of wood stacked really, really high, well, you've got the ceiling space, there was a loft area, and people on communes sometimes didn't care where they slept. Somebody put a wood stove at the top of the woodshed, but they did not properly, as what happened in the other commune, they didn't vent the wood stove the right way. And I want to give my compliments to the Messenger. So as a researcher, I saw that headline and that story from newspapers.com. So I went to Bridget Hingen, the associate editor of the Messenger, and I was like, if you guys have these old photos, could I take a look? So she was great. She gave me access to these photos. Members of the commune have taken a look at these, and they're like, yeah, we haven't seen that for 52 years, but that's exactly what the fire looked like. So as a researcher, what can this tell you? What can these photos that the messenger did not print all of these, but they have them in their archive. What can these old photos tell you? As a researcher, what might I want to do?
Well, it certainly shows that they weren't concerned about the upkeep of the buildings. It tells you what kind of vehicles they were driving, the trucks in the previous picture. I don't know.
Good.
General.
But those trucks might have been volunteer firefighters too.
Volunteer firefighters. One of these individuals is Marcel Plouffe, who's driving the buses for MVU now. He remembers being called out of school on the day of the fire. And I haven't had a chance to share these photos with him yet, but he says, yeah, he remembered going. And his comment was when he got there, he's like, these people are living in conditions that are desperate. Again, some more photos of the old house. You can see where the shed was, where the fire started. This is Mary Pat Palmer. The members of the commune tried to rebuild. They tried to rebuild in December of 1971. They tried to rebuild in January of 1971. And these are the photos of the rebuilding effort. Where did they stay? They stayed in a little cabin that they built in the woods. They stayed a little bit of time at the Warmants. And they stayed at other communes. And they rebuilt this in shifts. And they finished the outside, not the inside, as you get into the later part of sugaring season of 1972. And you can see that even though the building's not completely done, what are they doing? Sugaring is hard work, folks. Like buckets rather than pipeline. Like for any of the attitudes that we as locals may have about out-of-staters, like that's intense work. Collecting all of those buckets. So just a couple of research points. In reaching out to some of these people, it takes them a little while to get to know me and to become comfortable with what I'm after, and they know that I'm interested in writing a book. So I think there's a little bit of standoffishness, but then they know that I've talked to other people, and a couple of them have started to look through their old chests, and they've looked through their own attic. And this happened, I don't know how well you guys can see it, but this is from one of the communards. He was taking notes on his expense sheet from 1972 and 1973. Can you guys read what that says?
What's the title?
It says Riley's Store. That's the Franklin General Store, right in the center of town. This is the amount of money that they were spending at the Franklin General Store in April and May of 1972.
What was the amount?
I'm a social studies teacher, so $577, that's their account at that point in time.
I mean, that's what they owed the store then?
Yeah, so I don't know if they had a system of credit set up with Oscar Riley or not, but another interesting story. If people from out of state visited the Franklin Commune, because, so something that I think is a legitimate criticism, there was a lot of theft. Sometimes the hippies would go around to different stores and shoplift all of the time. The people at the Franklin Commune, when they got visitors, they said, do not shoplift from Oscar Riley's store, because we go in there all of the time, and we want to support that store as much as possible. So Jesse Drew, he's a runaway in the early 1970s. He ends up on the Franklin Commune. He also is somebody that I reached out to. He's now a professor at Berkeley, I believe. He went through his closets, he went through his old binders and everything. And for me, this is just research gold, because I can appreciate what my grandfather did with his sugaring operation, and I can appreciate anybody who does hard work and wants to learn to do things the old ways. and I have chickens on my property and a garden and everything, and I love doing those sort of homesteading activities, brewing dandelion wine, all of that stuff. Well, so this is May 11th, 1973. He's actually got the garden plots mentioned and who's taking care of the garden plots, which brings us close to an hour, which brings us close to an end. And by the way, I'm teaching at MVU at 1 o'clock, so I gotta make sure that I'm good here. So it's a little uncomfortable for me to bring this up, but I am gonna bring it up. We are in a public setting, and if it gives more information, then information or facts, etc. So there's a local family called the Patries. I have had zero contact with them. But after the fire, some members of the commune leave. And there aren't that many people left on the Franklin commune. The Patries sort of, or the Patries, they move in. And there immediately becomes conflict about how things are going to be done, how the gardens are going to be taken care of, and if we need money, is it appropriate to sell some of the commune tractors, to sell off the horses, etc. So I understand the Patry family is still local, but I have not reached out to them yet. These photos are from 1973. These are Jess Drew's photos, and they just give you sort of a sense. There aren't that many people around. The Patrys were working on and off with the people who were Peter McFarland, who was still, Hal Bill, who was still on the commune. But this is very close to the end. This is sometime during the summer of 1973, and there's a split. The Patry family wants to do things a certain way. The members of the left on the commune want to do something a certain way. And there's a couple of fistfights. There's at least one fistfight, and there's an incident with a gun. The gun does not go off, but you can imagine that it was a tense moment. And then to bring this, there's two ending points that I want to make, and if this brings up discussion. Do you remember I said earlier that sometimes locals did have that adversarial attitude? Do any of you remember the Paul Lawrence saga, the Paul Lawrence situation? So some of you could probably describe it better than me. Would you mind offering a word? What do you remember about that?
There was going back, there was a major concern about what was going on. Basically, in the city of St. Albans with drug use and drug abuse. And local one particular individual who was instrumental in, well, people have read, a lot of people here have probably read about injustice.
Mr. Campbell, yep.
Yeah. I was actually, in June of 1974, I began working as a drug abuse treatment action counselor at what was then Franklin North Mental Health in the aftermath, and worked with many of the folks who were caught up in the Paul Lawrence situation.
So
I also had some background, previous background in corrections. And, well, you know what happened with Paul Lawrence himself.
But I want to make sure that everybody is familiar or everybody remembers this situation. So remember, marijuana is classified as a narcotic. So in our minds, if we in Franklin County have not had a lot of experience with these drugs, marijuana is a narcotic. It's just as bad as heroin or cocaine. So Paul Lawrence has a history with the, I think, Vermont State Police. He gets hired by St. Albans PD, I believe, and he's setting kids up. Nobody from the Franklin commune, but certainly some of the other hippie colonies that are around the area. And he's an undercover agent, so he's not going around like pulling somebody over. He would go into a bar or whatever and ask one of the long hairs, hey, do you have any dope? Can we hang out? And then that person would be arrested on charges of cocaine or heroin. And he did this to not one person or two people, but I believe several dozen. And I personally believe, as somebody who was born and raised in Franklin County, this is a little bit of us, this is a little bit of local pushback, because not all of us liked the hippies. Not all of us accepted the hippies. We didn't want them around. And I say that somewhat firmly because Jim Levy, who's the local lawyer, he represented a lot of the people who Paul Lawrence set up. And if it goes to trial, and Levy is able to poke holes in the stories of a lot of these individuals. Yes, they were selling marijuana or they were smoking marijuana, but they didn't have any idea of cocaine. In fact, I think one person was actually with their parole officer when Paul Lawrence said that they were part of a drug transaction. So this is, from my view, a little bit of pushback from locals, because not everybody saw the hippies or saw the people on the communes the way that the Spooners did, the way that George Truax did. This book is no longer in print. Donna at the Eloquent Page, I believe, has bought up all of the copies that are left. And I plan on using this situation in my classroom because it is an interesting abuse of power discussion. So some of the members of the commune, they go back and they visit. This is Peter Hutcher going back in 1980. You can see the building, the house is gone, but the barn is still there. Peter took his kids. So 1980, it's the Reagan era. Peter's probably just going back to remember a lot. And the house was still standing. As of a couple of years ago, that winter house that they built, it was still standing. It's not there anymore. But I had the pleasure of working with the Franklin Historical Society. It was awesome. It was very meaningful for me. At the beginning of this school year, the last day of summer vacation, I was in teacher mode already. I worked with the Franklin Historical Society, and we wanted to do an anniversary event. So we put it out there as it's the anniversary of the Franklin Commune, 52 years later. This is Barb Nolfi, 52 years later. And as we're on the Franklin property, she said to me, "This is the first time I've been back in 50 years. And I was like, whoa, this is good. This is good. And not only was it special from this perspective, but Barb said, "Can I visit Nene Warman?" Nene's 90 years old, and the two of them sat at the Warman property and just chatted and let us take photos, and it meant a lot for me to be involved in setting this up. And then the Franklin Historical Society was nice enough to let these members of the commune, so this is Lou, the one that you saw walking near the barn with her child. This is Barb Nolfi. This is another individual from another commune who was in central Vermont. And this is Bruce Topp. And he's mentioned in the messenger stories that were posted earlier. And for as small of a community that Franklin is, we had 40 people on that day, some of them remembering, some of them locals who saw the communes, saw the communards, and maybe didn't have such a good view of them. But this event was really, really special to set up, and I think it was pretty well attended. So.
Very well attended.
So, yeah, that's my research. I think there's a book here. I'm going to continue to do research. I hope Hal Bill is open for more interviews. I'll email him later today. But I have a faculty meeting after class this afternoon, and then I have a Swanton Historical Society meeting after that. So I'm a little bit too busy right now.
So the time period, 70 to 73 or 69 to 75?
Yeah, so great question. The question was the time period for the commune movement or the back to the land movement. Things get started in like all over the country in late '69. There probably are a couple of properties in Vermont by that time period, but by the time you get into 1970, that's when a lot of these out-of-staters or a lot of these college kids are trying to set things up. So I would say from late 69 to maybe 73 or 74. That's when, I think the French Hill Commune was operating until the late 70s. So, any other questions?
Fizzled out very quickly.
What's that?
Most of them fizzled out.
Yes. And why would you say, why would the commune movement or the back to the land movement sort of fizzle? Why did a lot of these individuals move back to Burlington?
Hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard work.
There wasn't any money in it.
There wasn't any money.
They weren't all kids whose parents were wealthy. a lot of them were just average people. They didn't make any money. They didn't know how to plant corn. They didn't know how to feed animals. They thought they could just go and stick a seed in the ground and, wow, they've got food, but it's more than that to farming.
Numbers that were involved, dozens, hundreds, how many did
Oh,
you get for?
great question.
The one building that says that's home, but that's home to how many people?
So I think it's Playboy magazine has an estimate of tens of thousands of hippies
Like locally here, like
for the whole state.
It's on fire.
Right.
That was home to how many people lived in that home?
So how many people lived at Franklin at its peak? So 8 people started out.
Okay.
And some of them, they're married, but they weren't into the free love thing, but they very quickly separate from the partners they arrived with. In the summer of 1970, there's a couple of references where 40 or 50 people are living on the Franklin Commune. And some of them are just college kids, like they're there for a night. Others of them are staying for a week or two, and they're helping with the harvest, or they're visiting schooners, or they're slaughtering an animal. Yeah, so 8 people up to 40 or 50 people. Yep. Richard?
Listen, I think Republican Dean Davis, I think, was governor in the early 70s. He touched on this. How much of a political issue were the communes locally and in the state? Is that a big political issue, or?
I think it came up, but I was surprised. I didn't receive as much press as I would have thought. There are some comments, but didn't Davis actually visit one of the communes in the Northeast Kingdom? I think he visited one of the properties in the Northeast Kingdom. And I think a lot of locals were just, on some level, scratching their heads like, what are these kids doing? What are the, so was it a political issue? It was a political issue for some of us because we knew some of these individuals were on welfare and we thought that they were milking the system. And they will admit that they signed up for aid to needy families and children or whatever the program was at the time. But from their perspective, the program was available, and if they could make it look like they were looking for work, they could get the money. So was it political? There's, in particularly in South, it's somewhere in Lamoille County, they went after a couple of the hippies. They proved that they weren't working, and it did make the press. Yep.
The whole movement wasn't only people from other states, from urban areas, moving to commons. There were a lot of people down country who were moving up here on their own. Just a husband and a wife or a girlfriend and a guy and trying to live off the land that way.
So the comment was that it's not just about the communes, that it was other people who were buying houses, old farmhouses, and trying to do it on their own. And in fact, off from the commune, off from Shady Maple Lane, I'm not going to remember, the Einhart family? There's a back to the land family that he was a key maker. He set up shop and he didn't visit the commune often. He had his own chickens and he had his own farmstead. But yes, you're right. It was more than just the communes. Yep. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? So I can't end the presentation without saying I don't have the photos, but Bruce Taub and Lou, they actually got on the bus with some of my students. So I asked you guys a question. In the 1960s, would you have allowed these individuals to be around high school students? We went to Franklin, and we went down the first part of Shady Maple Lane, and then we visited. They said that they weren't going to come visit my class unless the students stopped by the Franklin General Store because they wanted to support the Franklin General Store. So I was like, that's all you want? Like, we can stop by the Franklin General Store. So it's been a pleasure doing this research. I love sharing my information with you. If any of you have stories which in any way associate with this time period, whether or not it's in association with Kent State, whether or not you lived in Franklin at the time, I would love to chat because even if it is families that lived on Beaver Meadow Road and saw the communards going by with the horses, like, that's very, very valuable information. And I think next generations should have access to that material. So thank you for your time. I appreciate your attention.